Welcome back, RP Plus. Dr. James Hoffman here, and sadly, we have come to the end. But hopefully, I feel like you've gotten a lot out of this. So what we're going to discuss in this last lecture series is what I like to call the Recovery Toolbox, which is a set of questions that are meant to help guide you in making good decisions about your recovery strategies. Now, you can actually apply these same questions to almost anything exercise science, nutritional science related, but I think they're pretty handy in the context of recovery. So my goal for this particular lecture is to give you a nice critical mindset to evaluate a lot of these things on your own when you have to go forth in the real world and encounter all these different things and make decisions about them. So why don't we jump right in? If we go on the first, you see the whole list here, and this is the entire list of questions, but we're going to break them down one by one. So the first question here in our recovery toolbox says, what does the scientific literature say on this particular method? Now, this is important for a couple of different reasons. The first one is generally, if there is not enough literature to have a scientific consensus on the topic or on the method, it's probably not worth your time. Now, does that mean it's bad? No. All that means is if we don't have a scientific consensus, we can just put it on the back burner, or maybe just table it for another time. That's probably a better way of thinking about it. So a lot of people will say like, oh, there's no papers or not enough papers on this or that, so it's bad. It's not bad. It could be awesome, right? So we just can't say with any certainty what the deal with this particular thing is. So all we have to do is scoop it up and just say like, you know what? I'm going to put you over here for now. Maybe I'll come back and revisit this idea in a couple years when there's more evidence. If there is not a scientific consensus, unfortunately, there's just not enough to go on. There is a reliance on things like anecdote and experience, and that is great and useful. But from here at RP, we're all scientists in the field, and we generally recommend, like if you can't find a meta-analysis or a literature review on the particular thing that you're looking at, all that means is just table it for another time and come back and revisit it later. If there is a scientific consensus on the topic, what is it? Go look it up. These are things that you can find on PubMed or many other resource websites where you can find peer-reviewed or even non-peer-reviewed things. But generally, that information is out there and available to you. So find out, what does the scientific literature say on this? Does it actually seem to be useful? Is it not useful? Does it have a large effect size, a small effect size, right? What's the deal with this? And that is probably going to be the first choke point on our recovery toolbox. Just from a kind of quantitative perspective, like, is there enough information to make any conclusions or even any remote conclusions on this topic? And if not, save it for later. If there is, and we have identified, hey, this seems to be something that's positive and meaningful in our discussion on recovery, then we can keep moving down the list and say, okay, let's move on to the next question. So scientific literature is definitely a good choking point and a good place to start. Now, what constitutes enough to have a scientific consensus? That is difficult to determine. Generally, what we like to use are the literature reviews and meta-analyses. When they can meet the criteria for those in a peer-reviewed sense, it's usually good to go. If not, and if you look at the article, the review, and it only has like 4 papers that it's citing, that's not very strong. Ideally, there should be more than 10, probably closer to 15 to 20 papers for it to be a really good review. And in other sciences like biology and medicine, possibly like hundreds of papers. But in exercise and sports science, we don't really have quite that volume yet. So for us, we say usually above 10, enough to do a really solid review or meta-analysis. That's probably pretty good. So then we move on to the next one. How does it actually work in promoting recovery and adaptation? So this is something that we can actually use in the first question, all that scientific literature that we've gathered on the topic. And usually in the intro portion of most of those articles, there should be quite a bit of background information. And then what we want to look for is, can we actually mechanistically explain or theorize as to how this directly works? Is there an explicit mechanism or series of mechanisms in which it operates to promote recovery and adaptation? If it is unknown, if it's one of those kind of magic towel type situations where you put the magic towel on somebody and their performance goes up, and you're like, I don't understand how that works. Maybe table it for later, right? if you read through it, everything looks great, all the papers are consistent, and they say it works through these mechanisms or these pathways in promoting recovery. Then you say, wow, that's great. It seems pretty clear. The research shows there's an effect, and we can explain, at least to some degree, how that effect is actually managed and worked. So that's really positive. When we say, okay, that means it goes in the thumbs up pile for now. If we can find a consensus of scientific literature, but we can't quite figure out how it works yet, then it goes in the maybe pile. Maybe table it for another time. We still want to have enough information to accurately describe the cellular mechanisms and how these things work. If we can't do that quite yet, doesn't mean it's bad, it just means table it for later. The next one. Is the net effect of this method adding fatigue or removing fatigue? This is probably my favorite question on the list. It's my favorite stopgap because it really is kind of brutal and concise, where you can look at something and it might be something like, maybe your friend says, oh, is your legs really sore? Go take a jog. And you might be like, I don't know about that jogging thing. That seems kind of weird. You can look at this question and go, does this particular method, in this case, jogging for sore legs, does this add fatigue or take fatigue away? And it's pretty clear that jogging almost exclusively adds fatigue and doesn't take any fatigue away in a meaningful way, right? Now, you can make a counterpoint and say, but James, didn't we talk about all that active recovery stuff? Where you said like light days and deloads and all that stuff was supposed to be really good, right? Well, don't you need to add a little bit of fatigue to train those things? You still have to do something. You still have to do some type of exercise to get those to work. That is an excellent point. And this is where we come full circle. What is the net effect of this method? And what we find with the active recovery stuff like deloads and tapers and light sessions, although we invest a little bit of energy into them, the overwhelming effect is incredibly anabolic and takes fatigue away. So although we add a little fatigue to make it happen, it gets washed out by the massive fatigue reducing effect. So the net effect is overall still fatigue reducing, right? Whereas adding something like jogging is really only adding fatigue and not taking fatigue away in any meaningful way. So this is kind of a nice, brutally simple one where you look at something or somebody tells you to do something and you ask, is this going to make me feel more tired? Is it going to make me more fatigued, more beat up? Or is it going to help take that away from me, right? If it does not take it away from you, at least in the net sense, it goes out in the trash. If we're not sure, it goes on the table. And if it does take fatigue away, hey, this seems like it's something that's pretty useful. And we can explain through the last couple questions how it actually takes the fatigue away, which is pretty sweet. So I love that one. It's one of my favorite ones. And it's probably one of the easiest choke points to start really smacking things out of the pool, like taking things out, putting things in, taking things out, putting things in. It's a really good question. I love that one. The next one. Can this method be explained or confounded by an already established method? We've already talked about this. The one that we see the most easily is relaxation, right? We've said countless times, many things that people do to promote recovery are simply a means or an avenue of promoting relaxation. It's not necessarily something that has a direct effect itself, but it's something that gets them to relax, which does have an effect, right? We see this kind of stuff all the time. So if you read something that says, your athletes should hold hands and sing Kumbaya after training, what does that actually mean? Does singing Kumbaya actually do anything? No. Does spending time with teammates and friends do something? Yeah, that's social support. What about just getting them to sit down and do nothing for a little bit? Well, that's relaxation. So although Kumbaya may not have any direct effects, it's just confounded by social support and relaxation. So it may have an indirect effect in the sense that it's an avenue of getting them to do some of the things that you want, right? So we always want to be kind of critical-minded and always analyze these things to say, like, can this actually be explained by something else? And probably the biggest one that you will find over and over is this idea of relaxation. Does whatever I'm looking at actually have a direct effect, or is it confounded by the idea of relaxation? Another example, which we see, is a hot bath, right? Hot bath seems to have some positive effects that we've already discussed, but can you differentiate them from the effects of water immersion and just being in a nice, relaxed, almost gravity-free state? That's difficult. It's difficult to differentiate those things because we know that they're there. So we see this a lot, and we want to make sure that we can at least put it out there and say, this seems to have an effect, but it may also be a byproduct of also promoting something else, right? Like relaxation, for example. So that's another really good one. And that one doesn't necessarily throw something out the window quite as harshly as some of the first few questions, but it's more for yourself to be critically minded and understand how the process works, right? Where you say, again, kumbaya is not what I want them to do. What I want them to do is spend time together, take their mind off the rigors of training, and relax for a little while. Kumbaya is an avenue for them to do that. See where I'm going with this? So it's just more of a thought process, a mindset to keep. Can this be explained by something else? What are the potential benefits and risks of using this method? So we know that not any particular method is inherently good or bad. They all have positives that we can take away, and they all have negatives that we can take away. And a great example of this was in our supplemental strategies discussion, where we said, hey, things like contrast, cold, heat, they shorten the recovery time, but it comes at the cost of the adaptive potential of the exercise. So there is a give and take, a push and pull that we should be aware of, right? So whenever we're looking at any of these strategies, we should be able to outline what are the positive things that they do, that they actually do, what are some of the costs associated with these things, and that will help us better formulate a timeline or a game plan as to how they can be implemented, right? Should I be using this method right now? Maybe not. Should I be using it later at a very specific time? Well, based on the pros and cons that I've outlined, this is actually better suited for this time rather than that time, right? Something along those lines. So we want to understand all the good, all the bad, so that we can better understand how to apply whatever it is that we're talking about. Next, what is the potential magnitude of the effect? This is where it can get a little mathy and statistical, but I can give you the quick and short version, right? When we're looking at some of these things, all of them can have an effect, which is statistically differentiable, where we say an effect versus no effect. And then within that, we can also look at the magnitude of the effect, which means how big was the change, or how big was the difference between the groups that they looked at. And what we find is that some things have very, very small effect size. Essentially, that means they have very, very small impact, whereas some things have massive, massive, massive effect size and impacts. So an example of this is when you're looking through the literature, you might find, if you look through the compression literature, that there is always a statistical effect, right? And that is a very, very consistent thing that you will find with very, very large sample sizes. Compression, always in effect. What is the magnitude of the effect? Well, it's actually teeny tiny. It's very, very small. Sometimes not even measurable, right? So one thing that we have to keep in mind is that, yes, you can prove something works with statistics. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing to do, right? Whereas something like sleep, right, has this massive, massive, massive effect size, so much so that it's one of the choke points in our discussion that we talked about earlier. So if you wanted to say like, compression and sleep are both statistically effective, they should be equal weights, right? No, that's when we use our effect size measurement to say sleep has a massive, monstrous effect size. Compression has a teeny tiny one. And you can use some really, really fancy statistical tools to get this. Sometimes it can be on very, very simple terms, like what was the percent change from this method and that method, and what's the difference between the two, right? Something just like a delta can be very, very useful if you're not trained in math and statistics. If you are trained in math and statistics, the effect size measurement can be extremely useful in differentiating very, very powerful and efficacious strategies to strategies which are useful but less powerful. So we want to know what is the impact of this method? How will it influence my training and my recovery paradigms that I have laid out, right? And that's just something we have to look into and what can be found in the scientific literature. Is there an appropriate time scale for use of this method? Some of these things can be used on a daily basis. For example, stress management and relaxation, something that we want to use all the time. Whereas something like deloads is something that we use, once every 3 to 6 weeks or so. And something else like an ice bath might be something we only use selectively when the athlete is in season and actively competing, right? We have to understand the pros and the cons of all these things so that we can understand when are they best used? What is the time scale of application? We know that deloads are great, but if you deload every other week, you'll be very, very much recovered, but what else will you not have? Well, you won't be making any progress either because you won't be training enough, right? So there's a time scale to all these things. We want to understand how we use this method And then at what time intervals are they most appropriately applied? And we already laid that out for a whole bunch of those things if you look back in the last lecture with the different tables. So you can see we already looked at that for you. We looked at dose and we looked at time scale. That's something that you want to look into as well as you go and explore new things. And then last, and unfortunately least, on this list, do I have any personal experience or evidence to support or refute this method? Anecdote and experience are not the best forms of evidence, but they are not crappy either. You can go back and look at things that you have done and evidence that you have collected from yourself or from your clients and say, you know, I may not know everything about this, but I can go back and pretty confidently say that there's something there. And I have measured an effect, whether it's a performance gaining effect, a recovery effect, a weight gaining effect, right? There's any number of things you can look at and you say, you know, I may not be this brainiest, most nerdiest, sciencey guy in the room, but I have used this and I am confident based on the numbers and data that I have collected for the last, 5 years of coaching, that there's something here, right? There's something to be said. Is that the best way to justify a position? No, but it's definitely something worth exploring. If you can provide some degree of anecdote or experience into the mix, you will be better off than having nothing else at all. Ideally, in the best case scenario, you will have some scientific evidence that explains how it works and how effective it is and when it should be used. And you will have some personal experience, whether it's with yourself or with your athletes or clients, where you have implemented the strategy and you have measured an effect. Now you have both, right? Now you can say, the science says it works. I have gone and used this in the field efficaciously with success. And I am confident, based on those two things, that this is a good method. The science backs it up. My personal experience backs it up. This is a thumbs up. That is perfect. That's ideal. That's what we want to see. Now, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. You might find something where this seems to be supported by science, and when you try and use it, it doesn't always work, and sometimes you get ho-hum results. Does that mean you should keep using it? Maybe not. Maybe not. Science isn't perfect. It's not always perfect. Sometimes we get things wrong, or sometimes there's bias, and sometimes people flat out lie and commit academic dishonesty. So we want to have a little blend of both, right? I believe the colloquial definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result, right? So if you read a paper that says, you should do this method, and you use this method just as it's written, and you keep getting a non-result or even a negative result, should you keep doing it? No, because it's not working, right? You can measure that it's not working. So there is an element there to anecdote and experience. It's not something that you should foo-foo and say, well, it's only science, it's only papers, right? Science and papers is great and very powerful, but you should be able to show in the real world with your real people that it does something and it works at least to some degree. If you can do that, it's probably worth your time. So essentially, this is our toolbox, right? And we say, can I get basically a check mark on all these items? If I can get a check mark on basically all of these, that thing that I'm looking at is good to go. It's safe bet. If I can only get a spattering of check marks, maybe not all of them, what does that mean? Table it for later. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean it's good either. It just means, you know what, I just don't know enough about this thing yet. Maybe I need to go use it in the field. Maybe I need to do some more research. I'm tabling it and coming back to it later. If you have very few check marks at all, probably not worth your time at all, right? So that's kind of how I look at these things, and many of my colleagues will tend to look at these things. And I think, frankly, this can be applied to all sorts of different stuff within exercise and nutritional sciences. Last, let's just look at a couple things using the same critical mindset, right? A few things, if you really look through the literature, that we can pretty clearly say don't work very well at all, right? Excessive flexibility and mobility training. What does that mean? Excessive means going above and beyond what you need to be successful in your sport or activity of choice. Are we saying that flexibility and mobility are bad for recovery? No, not at all. What we're saying is, if you try and do more flexibility and mobility training for the sake of recovering from sport and exercise beyond what you need to do within that sport, it doesn't do anything for you. And it does potentially come with some negative consequences later on if done to extremes, right? So flexibility, mobility doesn't really aid in recovery in any meaningful way. And when done in really, really high doses, can potentially have some negative side effects. Excessive cardio is another one that falls in that same line. There's this odd belief that doing cardio somehow makes you recover better. What we find is that that is largely confused with active recovery and taking light sessions, right? Taking a light session might be like taking a walk or maybe doing some light cycling or swimming or something like that. That works, that's great. Doing hard overload cardio does not meaningfully take fatigue away. It only adds fatigue, right? It's only causing an overload, which is good for the sake of doing cardio. It's not good from the perspective of doing something to enhance recovering from training. So a lot of times people will hear us talk on this and they'll go, hey, I started incorporating some of the things that you said. I started doing light sessions. And I'm like, wow, that's so cool. I love light sessions. What are you doing? And they're like, I push the prowler for an hour until I throw up. And I'm like, that's not a light session. That's cardio. And that's okay if you're doing it for cardio, right? But it's not okay if you're doing it to try and recover. We're not getting the desired effect. You're only making it worse, right? So excessive cardio essentially is going above and beyond the cardio demands of your sport for the sake of trying to recover from exercise. That does not work. In fact, it's almost exclusively negative. Each sport has its own cardio demand that needs to be met. And if you know me, you know I'm a very big advocate for that. However, what can be said is doing more than what you need is no benefit to you. In fact, it's probably a net negative, right? Prolonged heat exposure. We said that a little bit of heat goes a long way. Unfortunately, that little bit of heat is usually in bouts of like 30-ish minutes, something like that. Very, very acute exposure to heat can have a regenerative effect. More than about 45 minutes to an hour or so, people will start to succumb to the effects of heat stress and heat illness, right? Being exposed to the heat is an inherent stressor. It can make you dehydrated, and in many cases can lead to catastrophic injury and death, right? And this is something that we deal with in the United States during the month that we're in, which is August, when all of our high school athletes and middle school athletes go back out and work with the Coach Derps of the world, put on full pads and start doing triple practice days in the blazing hot summer. What happens to those poor kids? Well, every year we get many that go to the hospital and we get many that die from heat exposure, right? Heat is a stressor. Make no mistake about that. In our context, an acute bout of heat can be useful. Chronic exposure or longer bouts, being about 45 minutes to an hour or more, is actually going to be a net negative at that point because it is a net effect of heat stress and dehydration, and it's not going to have the tissue regenerative effects that we want. So no point in staying in that sauna for an hour, folks. Make it short and sweet. Relying on NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. This is taking like anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, for example. These drugs are perfectly fine, and they're great to use on a needs basis. However, they do have an anti-inflammatory effect and will start to blunt some of the fitness adaptations that you make. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's only a big deal if you are chronically relying on them, because then we have this kind of death by bee stings thing where it's just shaving off a little bit of fitness all the time. So it's going to be, fractions of a percent every time you use it, but those fractions of percents start to add up to whole percentages on the scale of decades, right? So we don't want to over-rely on NSAIDs. If you are someone who finds yourself not able to get through a normal training session without relying on pain medication or NSAIDs, you need to go back to the drawing board, homie, because you're fucked up and you're broken. You need to go back to the volume landmarks and reevaluate that. And the NSAIDs are probably not doing anything for you outside of just putting a Band-Aid on it and still allowing you to go and keep destroying yourself. Another thing you want to be wary of is when you rely on meds and pain medicine in general, is that you can get false negatives where you might actually be injured doing something like training or sport, and you are unaware because your pain is not perceiving correctly because of the pain meds that you've taken. Now, whatever little micro trauma that you have can become a macro trauma or serious problem as you continue to train on something that is injured. So we don't want to do that. That's bad. And then one that I already alluded to, kind of making light days really hard. When you take deloads and light days, they are meant to be explicitly easy for a very specific reason, because they are recovery promoting. A lot of people have kind of an ego or machismo thing that happens when you take a light session. They go, well, I feel like I'm not doing anything. I feel like I'm not training anymore, right? Because it's too easy. And then they want to make it really, really hard. And then they end up just negating the effect of taking the light session by overcompensating with intensity and or volume, right? So when you take light sessions, deloads, things like that, Make them easy. Don't make them really hard. They're supposed to be easy, and that's okay. It's not an ego check. It's not like you're dogging it and not doing a good job. You are setting yourself up for long-term training, and that might be from a mesocycle perspective or across different mesocycles, right? So taking a light day now means that you can now have 2 productive mesocycles of training instead of not taking a light day and then just succumbing to overreaching and having subsequent shitty mesocycles. Don't take it like an ego check thing. It's not that. When they're easy, it's meant to be easy. And when it's time to hit the gas, hit the gas. That's what we're saying, right? So those are some that are just inherently bad that we can already pretty confidently say, like, these are not good things you can do using the same recovery toolkit, right? What are some ones that are in the real world right now that we're not sure? Maybe we have tabled for now. Cupping is one example. And you can see in this nasty picture, this guy over here clearly has some gnarly cupping burns. It makes me cringe every time I see this picture, right? Now, is all cupping sessions going to end up like this? No, absolutely not. But it does happen, right? And it makes me wonder, even for people who don't have severe burns like this gentleman, whenever you see somebody get a cupping session, they're usually pretty severely bruised, right? So if we go back to questions like, is this adding or removing fatigue? It's very difficult for me to imagine that something that is leaving bruising and, in this case, burning to someone is removing any significant amount of fatigue. I can only think that this is adding fatigue. How is this removing fatigue? Somebody show me. I don't understand. What does the science say on this? Nothing, unfortunately. We just don't know. There's just not a clear amount. There's really not any literature on this particular topic in the context of recovering from sport and exercise. So at this current time, there's just no information. We can only speculate. So this goes into the maybe table pile because there's not a scientific consensus and we're really unclear as to how it works, if it works at all, and if it adds fatigue or takes fatigue away. If you want my candid opinion, I think it just adds fatigue, and I think this is probably stupid within this context. However, as a scientist, I gotta admit, we don't know, and I could be wrong. So we're gonna put it in the maybe pile and wait until more evidence comes on this. Electrical stimulation, using things like the TENS units and other stim units. These are things that have been used in physical therapy and athletic training for a very long time and have their uses. People have assumed that they will work in the same way for recovering from sport and exercise. What does the research say? The research shows about 50-50. About half of the studies say no real significant effects on recovery. About half of the studies say it does. The effects don't seem to be that strong, and it does seem to maybe do something, but not anything profound, right? So with the E-stim, what can we say at this point? Well, the literature really isn't clear. So just based on that question, we would table it for now. There does seem to be some limited evidence that suggests a positive recovery of exercise performance effect, but it doesn't seem to be anything unique. And they've actually shown the mechanisms don't seem to be any different than voluntary muscle contraction. It doesn't seem to operate on any different level outside of just the electricity being provided and stimulating the muscle, but the blood flow redistribution and the proposed mechanisms, how it works, seems to be virtually identical to voluntarily contracting the muscle. So there doesn't seem to be anything unique there. And based on that, the literature on this one is unclear. And it works basically through the same mechanisms or very similar mechanisms as active recovery. And we know active recovery works really freaking well. So if my candid opinion would be, table this one for now and use something that we know that works. Active recovery works through virtually the same proposed mechanisms and definitely has an effect, and it's very, very useful, right? E-stim seems kind of, if you want to be a little more blunt, seems kind of like a dick-wagging tool. It's just something cool to show off to your friends. I personally don't think it's going to have a very profound effect in the world of recovering from sport and exercise, but I could be wrong. The literature is unclear at the moment. So for now, what I think is safe to say is we've looked at the mechanisms, we've looked at the effect sizes, we've looked at the literature. We're unsure at the moment. So all we do is we put it on the side and we table it. We don't say it's good, we don't say it's bad. You can make a guesstimate, which is what I have done based on what I have seen, but I will by no means say that my guesstimates are 100% truth. We can only say this is what I think. I'm going to put it on the table for now and come back to it a little bit later. And then last on this list, dynamic compression. You already heard me advocate for dynamic compression a little bit earlier. That being said, we do have to kind of be a little skeptical on this one. We can't just take it at face value. Why? Well, there's just not a scientific consensus yet. There's maybe 3-ish papers, and they all seem to be positive. And there's hundreds of papers on static compression that seem to indicate static compression is great, but there is not a specific scientific consensus on dynamic compression. So it pains me to say this because my bias wants me to advocate for this one, and I still do. But if you want to be a real nitpicky scientist like you should be, you got to put it on the maybe table. And you can explore it and maybe look into it yourself and say, can I develop some anecdote and some experience with this, just like with the eStim, right? But can I say definitively with science that this is the way to go? Not sure. I personally think it is, and that is based on my anecdote and limited experience and parallels to static compression literature. But again, you got to be stanky on these things. And we say, you know what? I'm not sure. Maybe. Probably, but maybe. All right. That's it. We talked about all different stuff regarding recovery. I really hope you guys found this lecture series to be useful. If you want more in-depth information on these same topics, check out Recovering from Training. Your boy is the main author. Dr. Mike is one of the co-authors, and Dr. Fiance, aka Dr. Davis, is another co-author on that one. And it's a wonderful book. It gives all the same information in much greater detail. So if you're interested in this topic, please check that out. And I sincerely hope you guys enjoyed this lecture series. I hope to see you back for more here on RP Plus. Dr. James Hoffman, embracing my macho man for today and signing out.